Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving into something that shapes all of our lives, family, and how our understanding of it is kind of expanding to include the diverse experiences of LGBTQIA plus individuals.
Hmm.
It's pretty clear that when we talk about family, we're not talking about one single picture anymore, right?
Right.
And how society sees these different kinds of families is constantly on the move.
Absolutely. And for this deep dive, we've pulled together a really interesting collection of material. We've got to look at how perceptions of diverse families are changing in Korea. There's a KDI report comparing LGBTQIA plus experiences in South Korea and Brazil,
Right.
guidance from the UK government on single-sex services and the Equality Act, and even some of the science exploring the neurobiology of sexual orientation and gender identity.
Wow, okay. And that's just scratching the surface, it sounds like. We're also looking at Wikipedia's take on oppression and the social construction of gender,
Yep.
an academic article digging into sexual prejudice, a piece advocating for clearer rules around single-sex spaces,
Right.
a blog exploring the science of biological sex, and a CBS News breakdown of the difference between sexual orientation and gender identity.
Right. And to add even more layers, we'll be drawing from information provided by advocates for trans equality, an article from Very Well Mind on different types of sexual minorities,
Okay.
discussions on Reddit about non-traditional families and questioning biological essentialism, a YouGov poll on what the British public thinks about transgender rights,
Got it.
a Korean article on the spectrum of gender, online Korean reactions to a queer festival, a Namawiki entry on homosexuality, a description of the biological anatomical differences between sexes, and a Korean study looking at the work lives and mental well-being of sexual minority workers. Quite a mix.
So quite a lot to cover then.
Hmm.
Our mission today is to really dig into all of this and pull out the key insights. We want to give you, the listener, a clearer, more nuanced picture of these topics, especially if you're curious about how society is evolving and what that means for individuals. Okay, let's unpack this. Where do you think we should start to make sense of it all?
Well, I think a really solid foundation would be to make sure we're all on the same page with some of the core terms and ideas we'll be discussing.
Yeah,
It's just fundamental, really, to have a shared understanding as we go deeper.
makes total sense.
Yeah.
So if we look at, say, the CBS News article and the Wikipedia entry on gender, one of the first things we need to get clear on is the difference between sex, gender, and sexual orientation.
Precisely. So when we talk about sex, we're generally referring to biological characteristics, things like chromosomes, hormones, our physical anatomy.
Okay.
Now, the blog post on the science of biological sex reminds us that this isn't always as straightforward as we might think. There's actually quite a lot of natural variation.
Right.
Gender, on the other hand, as highlighted by that Wikipedia entry on the social construction of gender, is much more about the socially constructed roles, behaviors, expressions, and identities. Think of it as sort of how society and culture shape what's considered masculine or feminine.
So if I'm understanding correctly, sex is
Yeah.
more about the biological building blocks, maybe, and gender is like the social and cultural interpretation that gets layered on top.
Mm-hmm.
And then sexual orientation, which the CBS News piece also covers, is something else entirely.
Exactly. Sexual orientation is about who you're attracted to. It's that enduring pattern of romantic, emotional, and/or sexual attractions to other people.
Right.
That could be to men, women, people of more than one gender, or, no gender at all.
And it's really important, as the CBS News article emphasizes, that these are distinct things. Like someone's gender identity, how they feel inside and express their gender, doesn't automatically tell you anything about who they're attracted to, and vice versa.
That's a crucial distinction to keep in mind, definitely. Then, the Very Well Mind article helps us get a handle on the term sexual minorities.
Okay.
This generally refers to individuals whose sexual orientation or identity isn't part of the heterosexual majority. It typically involves consensual sexual activities between adults.
Hmm.
It's interesting to note, as the article points out, that while the definition focuses on sexual orientation and identity, it doesn't typically include things like paraphilias.
Right.
Also, while maybe not traditionally included, the polyamorous community is apparently increasingly seeking recognition under broader definitions of relationship diversity.
Okay, so we've got some key definitions under our belt. That's helpful. Now, let's shift our focus a bit. How about how perceptions of diverse families might be evolving, specifically in South Korea, based on that Korean article?
Yeah, the article Junia Echo Hengaya offers some really interesting insights here. Looking at the information, it seems there's, well, a trend in South Korea towards greater recognition of different family structures.
How so?
Well, the increasing visibility of various family forms in media and public discussions likely plays a role in this sort of gradual change. The data suggests a growing acceptance for non-traditional living arrangements, even though, the traditional nuclear family still holds a strong place in societal views.
So it's shifting, but maybe slowly.
Exactly. This gradual shift just underscores that societal norms around family aren't static. They evolve over time.
And to get a sense of where things stand right now, we have those online comments from the Dijon Mom Cafe about a queer festival. It sounds like there's still a pretty wide range of opinions and some strong feelings out there.
That's right. These comments really give us a window into some of the current social attitudes and concerns within certain communities. For example, one comment questioned, and I'm quoting here, "Is it really necessary to show such an indecent festival to growing children? Why should such a scandalous event be recognized as culture?"
Wow, okay.
Yeah, this really highlights a perspective that feels uncomfortable with such events, particularly in relation to children, and views them quite negatively. And it's vital, as you said, that we present these comments as a reflection of existing viewpoints without endorsing them ourselves. We're just trying to understand the spectrum of opinions.
Exactly, yeah. We're trying to understand the landscape, not pick a side. Now, it's fascinating to contrast these attitudes and the overall situation in South Korea with the experiences in Brazil, as detailed in that KDI report. It sounds like it paints a significantly different picture.
It truly does. The KDI report points to a really stark contrast in how LGBTQIA plus individuals are legally and socially accepted in South Korea compared to Brazil. Brazil actually recognized same-sex marriage way back in 2013.
2013, wow.
Yeah, and there are now over 10,000 same-sex marriages happening there every year. In South Korea, the report notes this kind of legal recognition hasn't even become a serious topic of legislative discussion yet.
That's a huge gap.
It is. And this legal difference really underscores how deeply cultural and historical factors can shape the societal integration of LGBTQIA plus individuals, moving beyond just individual acceptance to systemic recognition and rights.
And the report also shares a really powerful personal story, I think, that brings these differences to life.
Yes, it does. The report tells the story of someone working in Brazil's culture department who, despite not being out at work because they feared social judgment and violence, they felt a strong sense of community and safety in LGBTQIA plus spaces and at events like the São Paulo Pride Parade. There, they could freely express their sexual orientation and non-binary gender identity.
Right.
This personal account really brings the statistics to life, doesn't it? It just highlights how much environment can impact someone's sense of safety and belonging.
It really does. And the survey data from the KDI report further emphasizes this difference in how safe and protected LGBTQIA plus individuals feel in the two countries.
Yeah, the data is quite striking. Only a tiny fraction, like 3.1% of South Korean respondents in the KDI survey felt that their rights were legally protected,
Only 3%.
compared to a much larger 46% of Brazilian respondents. This clearly shows a significant gap in the sense of legal security. And as a result, the KDI report stresses the urgent need for comprehensive anti-discrimination laws in South Korea to provide that crucial protection.
Which then leads us directly to thinking about the broader challenges and, well, oppression faced by sexual minorities. We have the Wikipedia entry on oppression and that academic article on sexual prejudice and stigma to help us understand these bigger concepts.
Right, these sources give us some important frameworks. Sexual prejudice, basically, refers to negative attitudes and beliefs directed towards people because of their sexual orientation.
Okay.
Stigma, as the academic article discusses, building on Goffman's work, is essentially a mark of undesired differentness that society uses to devalue and marginalize certain groups.
Like a negative label.
Exactly. It's about the negative social regard and lower status assigned to people with particular characteristics. And then there's internalized stigma, which is when individuals within a stigmatized group start to believe and accept these negative societal views about themselves.
That sounds incredibly damaging. And the KDI report gives us some specific ways these concepts play out for LGBTQIA plus individuals in South Korea, right?
Definitely. The KDI report highlights the very real legal and social challenges they face, including a significant fear of social judgment and even violence. It includes personal stories of people in South Korea who, even without being openly out, experience subtle but hurtful negative comments from family and friends, creating this climate of fear around being their authentic selves.
Right.
Others expressed a general expectation of facing discrimination if they were open about their identity, just based on what they've seen in conversations, the media, online discussions.
And the lack of laws makes it worse.
Well, the fact that South Korea lacks comprehensive anti-discrimination laws, as the KDI report points out, makes this vulnerability even greater because there aren't clear legal avenues to address discriminatory treatment.
The Korean study on sexual minority workers also touches on how being open about one's identity can carry risks, mentioning the potential for outing.
Yes, that study really underscores the precarious position many sexual minority workers are in. Having their sexual orientation or gender identity revealed, whether intentionally or unintentionally through outing, can lead to really negative consequences in their professional and social lives.
It's important to remember, though, that while the social and legal environment has a huge impact, there's also a biological dimension to understanding sexual orientation and gender identity, which our neurobiology article explores.
Right. The article on the neurobiology of gender identity and sexual orientation summarizes the evidence we have so far about genetic contributions. Studies looking at families and twins suggest there's a moderate genetic component to sexual orientation.
Moderate, okay.
Yeah, one estimate suggests genetics might account for around 40% of the differences in sexual orientation among men and maybe about 20% among women. Research has looked at specific areas on chromosomes like XQ28 and associations with chromosomes 7 and 8.
Mhm.
Although these findings have been debated and haven't always been consistently found across different studies.
So not definitive.
Not definitive, no. A large study by 23andMe did find a suggestive genetic marker in that same region on chromosome 8 in men. The article also mentions the potential role of epigenetics, changes in gene expression in male sexual orientation, but, more research is needed there.
Okay.
Ultimately, the science points to some kind of biological inclination for sexual orientation, but the precise mechanisms remain complex. It's an interplay, and it cautions against simplistic biological determinism.
And what about the effects of hormones before birth? The article touches on that as well, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. Research on women with congenital adrenal hyperplasia, CAH, who are exposed to higher levels of androgens, sort of male hormones in the womb, shows they are less likely to identify as exclusively heterosexual and report more same-sex attraction and behavior, which suggests that prenatal hormone exposure can influence the development of sexual orientation. Similarly, studies on XY individuals with cloacal exstrophy, many of whom were raised as girls but later identified as male and were attracted to females, that points to a possible role for prenatal testosterone in shaping what we might think of as a more typical male sexual orientation.
But again, not the whole story.
Exactly. The article is careful to emphasize that these effects aren't universal, meaning hormones aren't the only deciding factor. It's not deterministic.
So the science seems to indicate a biological influence, but it's a really complex picture with many factors involved, and our understanding is still, well, developing.
Precisely. The article concludes that while there's likely a significant biological contribution to sexual identity and orientation, our current knowledge is limited, and it's probably the result of a combination of genetic, hormonal, and possibly environmental factors. It also highlights some of the challenges in this research, like small study sizes and potential biases in who participates.
Okay. Now, shifting gears a bit, let's think about the social and institutional side of things. That UK government guidance on the Equality Act gives us a framework for how to consider service provision for trans people in single-sex spaces.
Right. This guidance stresses that service providers need to carefully consider the impact on everyone who uses their services when thinking about how trans people access those services.
So a balancing act.
Sort of, yeah. It introduces this idea of proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. And a legitimate aim could be something like ensuring privacy and dignity for all service users.
Okay.
So any decision to limit or exclude a trans person's access needs to be carefully thought through and be a proportionate way to achieve that legitimate aim. For example, proportionate means might mean putting up privacy screens in changing rooms instead of an outright ban.
And it's interesting that the guidance specifically says that service providers don't need to see a gender recognition certificate, a GRC, to make these decisions.
Yeah, and actually asking for one could even be a breach of someone's privacy. That's a really important point. The guidance makes it clear that protection under the gender reassignment aspect of the Equality Act doesn't depend on someone having a GRC. So service providers should really focus on whether their actions are a balanced and justifiable way to achieve a legitimate goal, rather than getting hung up on documentation.
Okay. On the other hand, we have the viewpoint from that excerpt arguing that Single-sex spaces are not adequately protected. This perspective raises concerns about individuals perceived as male using female facilities, and how that might affect the expectations and sense of safety in those spaces, particularly for women and girls.
Yeah, this excerpt voices a concern that the long-held understanding of single-sex spaces, like restrooms and changing areas, being exclusively for one sex is being undermined. It highlights instances where individuals perceived as male have used female facilities, which has led to discomfort, and in some reported cases, teenage girls being denied access because of these concerns. The author argues for clearer rules and laws to reinforce the legitimacy of single-sex spaces in situations where rights seem to conflict.
These different viewpoints really highlight how complex and, frankly, sensitive these issues are to navigate. It brings us back to the idea of the social construction of gender, which our Wikipedia entry also touches on in the context of doing gender.
Right. The concept of doing gender, as explained in the Wikipedia entry and the work of West and Zimmerman, suggests that gender isn't just something we inherently are, but it's something we actively do through our interactions with others.
Performing gender, almost.
Kinda, yeah.
Yeah.
It's about how we present ourselves and how we're perceived based on society's expectations around gender. Think of it like learning the rules of a game. Just like different cultures have different games with different rules, they also have different expectations and understandings of what it means to be a man or a woman. The entry also points out how much things like education and the media influence how we learn and perform these gender roles from a very young age.
And the Korean study on sexual minority workers really brings home how these social constructs can have very real and tangible impacts on people's lives, particularly in the workplace.
Oh, absolutely. The study reveals the discrimination that sexual minority workers face when applying for jobs, and this is apparently especially true for transgender individuals and those who express their gender in non-traditional ways.
How bad is it?
Well, a significant 22.6% of respondents with diverse gender identities or expressions reported giving up on job applications because they were worried about how their identity would be perceived.
Wow, nearly a quarter.
And for transgender individuals, this number was even higher, a shocking 61.0%.
61%.
Yeah. This really highlights the systemic barriers they encounter right from the start. It's just huge.
That story about the job seeker who hesitated to fully disclose their LGBTQ plus activism is particularly striking too.
Yes, the experience of O really illustrates the difficult tightrope many people walk. They wanted to work for a company that would be accepting of their activism, but worried about potential negative consequences if they were too open about it during the hiring process.
That constant calculation.
Exactly. This fear of discrimination and the need to carefully manage how much of themselves to reveal is a significant source of stress.
The study also points to the issue of unwanted job changes because of harassment at work and the broader problem of bullying in the workplace generally.
Yeah, and while workplace bullying isn't something that only sexual minorities experience, of course, the Korean study suggests they are particularly vulnerable. Drawing on a 2024 survey, it notes that a significant portion of the general working population experiences bullying. And the study indicates that this issue can contribute to sexual minority workers feeling they have no choice but to leave their jobs.
And those examples of microaggressions from the Korean study, they really highlight the subtle but constant forms of discrimination that people face.
They really do. These microaggressions, things like being repeatedly asked about marriage even after saying they're not interested, or feeling the need to constantly change stories about their partners to avoid revealing a same-sex relationship.
Exhausting.
It can create a really invalidating and even hostile environment for sexual minority workers. They serve as constant reminders of being different and can take a significant toll on their mental well-being over time.
It's not all negative, though, is it? The Korean study also found examples of LGBTQIA+ individuals who were managing their mental health well and even using their identity in positive ways in their professional lives.
That's a really important point to remember, yes. The study highlights the resilience and agency of many individuals. For example, Q, who works as an art educator, actively thinks about the LGBTQIA+ students in their classes and makes sure to incorporate diverse themes in their teaching.
That's great.
Yeah, and this not only makes their work more meaningful for them, but also helps them connect with their students on a deeper level. And Elle's reflection on how their neurodiversity might intersect with their queer identity also offers a really powerful perspective on self-acceptance and understanding.
Okay, shifting our focus back to the UK now. That YouGov poll gives us a snapshot of what the British public thinks about transgender rights in early 2025, and it seems there's been a shift in attitudes.
Yeah, the poll indicates a growing skepticism towards transgender rights in Britain since 2022. There's significant public opposition to proposals like allowing self-identification for gender recognition certificates,
Right.
removing the need for a medical panel to approve applications, and reducing the 2-year period of living in one's affirmed gender.
Hmm.
It's interesting to think about why this shift might be happening. Is it linked to specific events or ongoing public debates, maybe?
Hard to say for sure from just the poll.
Yeah.
And public opinion also seems to be largely against the NHS providing gender transition treatments.
That's right. A majority of those surveyed expressed opposition to gender reassignment surgery and hormone treatments being available through the National Health Service.
Interestingly, though, the poll did find a connection between knowing someone who is transgender and having more supportive views on transgender rights.
Hmm.
But it wasn't a magic bullet, right?
No, exactly. The poll highlights that while familiarity does tend to increase support, there are still areas where support remains limited, even among those who know transgender individuals.
Like what?
A notable example is the participation of trans women in women's sports, which only receives support from about a third of those in the Know Someone Transgender group.
Okay.
Similarly, even among those who believe a person should be able to change their legal gender, there was still limited support for some specific aspects of that process, like not requiring a 2-year waiting period. So familiarity helps, but doesn't guarantee agreement on everything.
Right. Okay, finally, to broaden our horizons even further, let's just quickly peek at those Reddit discussions on non-traditional families in world building and critiques of biological essentialism. These offer some really fascinating sort of hypothetical and theoretical perspectives.
Yeah, the world-building Reddit discussion truly showcases the incredible variety of possible societal structures and attitudes towards family, gender, and relationships in fictional worlds. It's quite imaginative.
Like what kind of things?
Well, we see examples ranging from state-controlled child rearing and communal living to the acceptance of same-sex parents using artificial wombs, and vastly different levels of acceptance based on cultural norms or even post-apocalyptic scenarios.
Wow.
It really drives home the point that what we consider traditional is far from universal and can be incredibly adaptable, at least in fiction.
And the discussion around critiques of biological essentialism, what's that about?
Well, this Reddit thread highlights arguments against biological essentialism. That's the idea that traits like gender roles are fundamentally fixed by biology. It emphasizes that gender is largely a social construct and raises concerns about potential biases in research that tries to link gender roles solely to biology. Some argue that relying too heavily on biological explanations can reinforce existing inequalities and doesn't account for the wide range of human experiences and expressions.
So challenging the "it's just biology" argument.
Essentially, yes. It's questioning how much is biology versus how much is culture and society shaping things.
Okay. Wow. This has been a truly deep dive into a really complex and fascinating area. It's so clear that understanding diverse family structures and the experiences of LGBTQIA+ individuals requires us to consider how biology, social norms, laws, personal stories, and shifting societal views all kind of mesh together.
Absolutely. Recognizing the nuances within each of these areas is just so important for building a more inclusive and equitable society for everyone. There really are no easy answers, are there? And ongoing learning and open conversation feel essential.
Definitely. So, as we wrap things up, here's a final thought for you, our listener, to consider. Given all the diverse perspectives and experiences we've explored today, how might your own understanding of family and identity continue to evolve in the years ahead? And what role do you think legal protections and social acceptance play in both the well-being of individuals and the progress of our society as a whole? We encourage you to think about your own assumptions and maybe even explore some of the resources we've touched on today. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.